Alright, hi everyone, welcome to this video, which is an intro to the chapter of inheritance. Right, so in this video, we'll explore some of the terms and the definitions that you'll see throughout the entire chapter so that you have a better understanding of when these terms are being used. So before we get started, so there's three pictures over here, right, of three different girls. Right, but I want you to think about how exactly are these three girls related to one another. Okay, so I think it's not that hard to tell that most likely these three girls are from the same family, right? In fact, maybe through a family tree, whereby one is the grandma, one is the mom, and one is the daughter, right? And how do we tell that? We actually tell that through the appearance, some traits that we see, some characteristics of the person, right? Maybe the eyes, the face shape, the hair color, so on and so forth. So this is actually what this entire chapter is about. It helps us to understand how exactly are characteristics passed down from parents to us, right? And why aren't we exactly like our parents? Now, what about yourself, right? I'm sure that you have certain features that looks like your mom, certain features that looks like your dad, right? But what makes us not exactly the same as either of them, right? That actually has to do with this concept of inheritance. So this is the chapter that we'll be talking about. So just a bit of intro, right? Inheritance actually refers to the passing down of genetic materials to the offsprings, right? So from parents to offsprings. And the study of this entire thing is called genetics. So a bit of recap, what exactly is found in the nucleus of the cells? Right, so if you recall, we learned about this in Sec 3. The nucleus is supposed to control all cell activities because it contains something, right? And I think that it has inside is what we call chromatin threads, right? So chromatin threads are actually structures that contain DNA, right? The DNA will eventually tell us who we are and also allow the cells to perform its function. So this video will actually touch on some basic knowledge that you need to know before you can go on to the rest of the videos. We'll talk about some of these definition, how to describe and explain some of the terms that you see over here. So let's start with the first one. Okay, the term hereditary traits, right? Traits by definition refers to something that can be passed down, right? So it's a characteristics of a person or of an organism, right? So it can be your face color, your face shape, eye color, ability to roll the tongues, the type of hair that you have, whether is it curly or is it straight, the hair color, skin color, blood type, etc. These things that can be passed down are what we call traits, right? We're interested in all these things. We're not interested in things that cannot be passed down. So for example, piercing of the ears, tattoos, right? So these things cannot be passed down to your offsprings. So we will talk about all this within our chapter, right? We'll talk about things that is can be passed down from parents to offspring. So some basic definition to understand. Chromosome is actually just a condensed version of the chromatin threads. So condensed means that it's being coiled up, right? So a coiled up structure, chromatin thread is like a string, right? So it's a string over here. So if you take one string, anything that you have at home, right, you coil it up, that's it's the same as from chromatin thread to chromosome. So it's exactly the same thing at the end. But what makes them different from DNA? So chromosome is not exactly DNA because it's actually made up of DNA that's being wrapped around proteins. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in the next chapter on genetics. Now in humans, okay, we learned that in human cells, we have 46 chromosomes, or what we call a diploid structure, right? So this is same for all the cells in humans except for the sex cells, the gametes, which is your sperm and ovum, which has a haploid. Right, haploid refers to half of the total amount. Right, so for humans we have 46 because we actually get 23 from the mom, 23 from the dad, and these 23 can actually pair up together. That's what we call homologous chromosome. So they're the same type of chromosome in a way, but each carrying a different style of the trait. So these are the 23 pairs of chromosomes, right, which is the 46 that you have inside your cells. Of course, you look closely at the end, right? The 23rd pair is actually a combination of what we call X and Y chromosomes, or the sex chromosomes. We should talk about it at the end of the chapter. So this part of the video, right, we'll start to touch on what exactly are the things that allows us to look like who we are, right? So we have this thing called genes, right? We've learned about this term, we heard about it, right? So what exactly does it mean? It actually refers to a sequence of nucleotides. Now nucleotides are actually the basic unit of DNA. So they mix up your DNA. Each DNA is made up of tens of thousands of millions of nucleotides, right? So a few of them. So a sequence refers to a few of them, right? So a few of them in a certain order that controls the production of a specific polypeptide. which will eventually give you a protein, right? So we learned that polypeptide will fall into proteins. So a gene is actually just a part of the DNA that allows us to produce a certain type of proteins, right? So what are these proteins? It can be a protein that controls the eye color, a protein that controls the hormone insulin, a protein that controls enzyme, for example, right? And all these genes are actually found on the chromosome, right? The position that they occupy is called the locus. Don't need to worry so much about it. It just tells you that it's somewhere on the chromosome. So these are genes. So they control a certain features. Okay, so within a pair of homologous chromosome, you can find a gene at the same position on the entire chromosome. Okay, but that is gene. Okay, so gene is actually, okay, it tells us what exactly are the characteristics that we're interested in, but not entirely so, right? So for example, let's say for eye color, right? So if you talk about a gene that controls eye color, the question that you might have now is that, but then there's different types of eye color, right? There can be brown, blue, green, gray, so on and so forth. So what exactly gives the changes, the differences in the eye color? They are still about eye colors, but there's difference between the different color, right? So it's actually due to alleles, right? So allele is a new term over here. It actually refers to a different form of the same gene. So they are still supposed to be related to the same traits, right? So if it's about eye color, all these alleles should be about eye color, okay? And we can actually represent them by using letters, right? So to show alleles, right, we use letters to represent them. So some of the alleles are what we call dominant alleles, some are what we call recessive alleles, right? So the meaning of dominant is that they will mainly be shown. That means whatever is this color, right, of the eye will be shown. The meaning of recessive is that it is hardly shown, right? So why exactly is the case? We'll learn about something else called genotype later on. But basically now it's trying to tell you that, okay, for alleles, right, we can use letters to represent them. And how do we tell them apart? Okay, we use big letters, uppercase and lowercase, right? So capital T for dominant one, smaller t for a recessive one, right? It doesn't need to be T, it can also be other alphabets, right, like H, right? So H can be the dominant one for a certain kind of allele, then the small h will be the recessive one for the certain kind of allele. So it can be any alphabets, any letters. So just a quick checkpoint, right? So within the cell, there's a nucleus. Within it, we can find the chromosomes, right? And within the chromosomes, we can find the DNA, and within the DNA, we can find the gene, right? So gene is just a part of the entire thing. So imagine to say that if, let's say this is a DNA, this long string, it's a DNA, how will a gene be represented in this diagram? We can actually represent a gene by saying that, okay, from this part to this part, this is a gene for eye color, right? But somewhere along the entire DNA, there might be another part over here, the gene for skin color, let's say as an example, right? So there can be multiple genes within a DNA, and all the DNA is packed within a 46 chromosome. So we're going to explore two more new terms. One is called genotype, and one is called phenotype, right? Genotype, as the name suggests, tells you the type of gene that is inside the person, right? So it's actually referring to the genetic makeup of the organism. So what exactly did this person receive from the parents? So we can represent them by saying that it's homozygous, right? So the term homo actually means same. Okay? When we say that a person has a homozygous genotype, what we're trying to say is that maybe for that particular gene, they have both of the same allele. So both is big T, for example. That's what I call homozygous dominant. Why dominant? Because big T, capital letter, is dominant allele, right? Since it's capital letter, we know that's a dominant allele. Alternatively, it could also be that this particular offspring have both of the small letter, right? And that's what we call homozygous recessive. Why is it homozygous recessive? Because the small t is a recessive allele, right? So when you have two of it, the same one, then we call it homozygous recessive. Now, can there be a condition whereby there is a mixture, right? So a big T and small t. And the answer is yes, you can have that. And that's what we call heterozygous. Heterozygous means different, right? So the word hetero means is different. Heterosexual means a guy and a girl, right? So big T and small t, that shows you a heterozygous genotype. So what exactly is the purpose of learning about all these things, right? What is the purpose of knowing about whether is it homozygous big T, or homozygous small t, or whether is it just a big T and a small t? What does it impact on the person? How does it make us who we are, right? It's important to understand that when you look at a genotype, right? When you look at, let's say that you see two letters over here. One of them actually it came from mom, one actually came from dad. So actually each of your parents will give you one allele for that particular trait, right? Then when the two alleles comes together, right? So each parent give 1, right? So you have end up with 2. Then we actually look at what exactly is the combination, which is called a genotype, and that will actually determine how you show that entire trait, right? So that is something that we call a phenotype, which you'll learn later on. So let's take a look at just some examples. Okay, so a dominant allele, right? A dominant allele will always show itself whether or not it's in the homozygous dominant or heterozygous condition. So for example, if you have big T, right, there's only the dominant alleles within the entire genotype. You know that it will always be shown, right? So if big T represents, say, that the person will be tall, and both parents pass down the tall allele to the child, right? The child will be tall. Okay. Now, heterozygous condition whereby you have a big T and small t. Let's say the mom passed down the big T, the dad passed down the small t. Right? So the mom is taller, that has a tall allele. But because of the fact that the person still has a big T and is a dominant one, which will always be shown, the person will still end up being tall, right? Because you already have one, you just need one of it to show the thing. But in order for you to show the recessive allele traits, which is the short trait, you need to have double small t, whereby one came from the mom and one must come from the dad. So in this case, you will have a short trait, right? So you appear shorter. Okay? But of course, this is just a simplified example. It can be about anything. It can be about eye color, it can be about skin color. Don't need to be about height. So let's take for example, let's say that you have the allele for tall height being capital T and the allele for short height being small letter t, right? So by looking at just the capital and small letter, you know that this is actually dominant. So we know that tall is dominant. Okay, this is actually recessive. So we know that short is actually recessive, right? So if a person is born with this genotype, a big T and a small t, the fact that the person already has one of the capital T shows that he or she will only show out the dominant one, which is to be tall, right? So in this outcome, the person will be tall. For the outcome over here, because the person has 2 or double of the small t, right? So if you have double of the small t, it will mean that you only have the recessive alleles. So if you only have the recessive alleles, you know that this person will likely be short, okay, or rather can only be short, right? So because there isn't the tall allele. And the last outcome, let's say that you have double of T, right? Both is dominant. Okay. Unfortunately, not like what we think. It's not that the person will be super tall, right? The fact that there's one of it is good enough, and this person will still be tall, right? Doesn't mean that you have 2 of the big T allele, means that it will be double the height. Okay. As long as you have one of it, you will show the trait. Lastly, we spoke about this thing called phenotype, right? Phenotype refers to what exactly do you observe. So when I talk about the photo at the start of the video, right, these 3 girls that you see over here, what exactly are you looking out for? Right, if you look at the hair color, that they have blonde hair, or if you look at the eye, let's say that they have double eyelid, or if you look at let's say the ear and whatnot, right, these things that you are looking at are what we call phenotypes, right? So what exactly determines the phenotype? Okay, what gives the organism the characteristics that you are looking at is actually dependent on the genotype. So genotype is what they get from the parents. So basically, one of the parents will pass down a certain set of alleles. The other parents will pass down another set of alleles. Right? Then together, this gives you the genotype of the individual, which will then give you the phenotype, which is what we see. Okay, so phenotype refers to what you can observe from the person. Okay, so phenotype can also be affected by a few things. It can be affected by what exactly is the person born with, the genotype, or it can be affected by the environment. Right? So the environment meaning to say that, let's say that you are born with very, very fair skin, right? So that is something that you are born with. But if you go under the sun for too long, you become tanner, right? So the phenotype changes. So your darker skin is not a result of what your parents gave you, but a result of the environment. Okay? For example, let's say that you have curly hair, right? So but you decide to go for rebonding, then end up your hair becomes straight, right? So that is not because of what your parents gave you, but because of something that you did, right? So it's an environmental factor that happened. Okay? And with that, just one last question to think about. So let's say that in the mice, the allele for long fur being L, capital L, is dominant, and the allele for short fur being recessive, small letter L. What do you think are the phenotypes for these following 3 genotypes? Okay, so think about this and we will explore it when we come back to class. Thank you.